and welcome to this latest video in my deconstruction series. Today I'm going to be talking about my deconstruction process through Judaism. So after I came to the conclusion that the Israelites were historically Canaanite and that their origin story was a bit less dramatic than what the Old Testament depicts, and that archaeological, anthropological records, historical records, really just indicate that the Israelites, before they became, the monarchy of David and Solomon, really were just another Canaanite tribe. And once I came to that conclusion, naturally, the next thing that I began to question really was Judaism itself, right? So if the Israelites are really just another brand of Canaanite, then where did the Jewish religion come from? Are there any correlations with Judaism and Canaanite religions and with Canaanite gods? So those kinds of questions led me to look into the religious culture of the Canaanites themselves. So when we're talking about Canaanite deities, we are referring to gods that were worshipped by groups such as the Amorites, Amalekites, Jebusites, Moabites, right? All those fun names that you read. And when it comes to the Israelites, I discussed in the previous video, when trying to find parallels with Judaism and Canaanite culture, the Ugaritic texts are really invaluable. And so for this topic, we return to Ugarit and the Ugaritic texts, and you find that the Ugaritic texts and their depictions of the Canaanite pantheon, their mythologies, their stories, it parallels pretty nicely with the Israelite stories. So if you're watching this video and you haven't watched the one before this, I'll give you a little bit of background about Ugarit. There were tablets found at this site of an ancient city known as Ugarit, dating from 1500 BCE to 1200 BCE, and they attest to aspects of Canaanite culture and mythology. In these texts, they really offer significant insights into the development of Hebrew culture and Hebrew language, and as we'll see, Hebrew religion. And I think what will become clear in this video is that what the early Israelites did as they were developing their own narrative, just really adopted the myths and the stories that were already there in the Canaanite culture, and modified those to separate themselves from their Canaanite neighbors, probably as they began to gain prominence in the land itself. So the Canaanite religion itself is polytheistic, was polytheistic. Like other polytheistic cultures, the gods are limited in their power and wisdom. They're not omnipotent, they're not omnipresent or omniscient. And some of the key figures in the Canaanite pantheon is the god El, which is depicted as a sky god, a father of gods and a father of humans, creator of humans. And Asherah was Asherah was his wife, and their daughter was Anat, the goddess of love and war. Baal was a storm god, and Baal defeated the chaotic sea god, and Mot was the god of death. And I'm borrowing a lot of this information from a lecture done by Christine Hayes, who is a Yale University instructor, and she came up with a list of a lot of general themes that you see played out in these ancient polytheistic religions. And I think that this is important just to show you the culture that the Israelites were a part of and then were emerging from as they began to set themselves apart, their culture, their sort of national identity apart from others around them. So typically with polytheistic religions, you have gods are born, they can die, and they can be resurrected. So they're immortal, kind of, but they can die, but they can be resurrected. Gods seem to draw their power from the sort of meta-divine realm, Magic and divination by humans is possible by manipulating material substances that are connected to this meta-divine realm. This realm is the source of all things, is the source of good and evil. And the idea of salvation, according to Christine Hayes, is for humans is that it's attained through magic and secret knowledge, sort of being initiated into secrets, and you might find favor with the gods, right? And then finally, the universe itself is considered to be amoral. There's really no teleology with humanity in polytheism. It's kind of like the gods make humans, gods make, everything, and people just sort of try to make it. And they hope that they can find favor with the gods, right? It's a lot of chaos, or organized chaos, maybe. But there's no real purpose to anything. And this is in stark contrast to the eventual emergence of monotheism. But some have argued that the Jews, at least ancient Judaism, was not monotheistic, but that they were actually monolatrists, or they practiced monolatry, which was essentially the idea that there are many gods, but there's only one all-powerful God that should be worshipped. And I think there's a lot of credibility to that argument, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But when monotheism came onto the scene, that truly was a radically new idea. This idea of an all-powerful God, absolute sovereign, the only creator of the universe. That just was more or less unheard of, except for Hinduism. But that can be another video for another time. So the Hebrew God is depicted as supreme, the supreme monarch. He's timeless, ageless, eternal. This God is transcendent, and nothing happens that isn't caused by him or that he doesn't allow to happen. And another really interesting difference between Judaism and typically what you would see in the Canaanite religion was, or just polytheism in general, was that the Jewish God actually was concerned with humanity, whereas before the gods, and you see this, I think, with pretty much all of the pagan polytheistic religions, where like the gods basically use humans as pawns in this cosmic game, right? And you really don't have that as an underlying theme in Judaism. Okay, so I want to get into some of the key Canaanite gods, and I'm going to start with El. So El literally means God and is the personal name for the head of the Canaanite pantheon, and he's the head of the council of gods in Ugarit as well as other Canaanite cultures. And El is the father of all creatures. He's depicted as a king. He protects patriarchs. He guides and promises them descendants. He is seated before the divine council, or El's family, as its head. And he is also called the Ageless One. He's referred to as being timeless. Father of years has been used to describe him. He's kind, he's compassionate. And in the Ugaritic text, El is depicted as a provider of children. And that's really interesting because in Genesis we have Abraham and Sarah who cannot conceive a child, and God promises them a child and eventually provides them with one. But there's a parallel story in the Ugaritic text, which is referred to as the Keret epic. And there you have King Keret asks the father god El for a blessing of children, saying, "Grant that I may get sons, grant that I may multiply kin." And the bull El, his father, answered with kind words while Keret wept, while the gracious one, servitor of El, shed tears. El then tells Keret to go and offer sacrifices, including a sacrificial lamb, to be provided with a way to obtain a wife to bear him children. El is also seen as dwelling on a remote mountain in the north which has a direct biblical correlation in Isaiah 14:13, which reads, "For you said to yourself, I will ascend to heaven and set my throne above the stars. I will preside on the mountain of the gods far away in the north." And El is also said to dwell in a tent or a pavilion or a tabernacle. And this is similar to the tent of meeting that we read about in Exodus, where it says that God commands Moses to build him a tabernacle or a tent for him to dwell in. And further references are in Psalm 78:60, Joshua 18:1, and Samuel 2:22. And El seems to be a very ancient god. He seems to be depicted as far back as 2500 BCE in some of the earliest Akkadian sources, and he's also just in general referred to throughout Semitic culture. And so it would stand to reason that because El was such a prominent figure in Canaanite culture for such a long time, the people who would become Israel, El would have been a prominent figure in their mind and would have to become a major player in the development of their religion. And so as we see Judaism developing in the book of Genesis, it was just very evident that El was the god of the biblical patriarchs. We have a lot of references to El. God is called in Genesis titles like El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam, El Roy. Many of the personal places and names in the patriarchal narratives are compound names where one of the elements of the name is El, so like Israel, or Ishmael, or Bethel. And some examples of El being worshipped would be in Genesis 14:19, where it says, "And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth." In this phrase, this title, God Most High, is El Elyon. And according to passages like these, Abraham was clearly a follower of El. Then also Genesis 17:1, Abraham is depicted as worshiping El Shaddai. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless." The Hebrew word here for God Almighty is El Shaddai. El Shaddai is a Ugaritic Canaanite god, one of the 70 Elohim or sons of El. Then also in 82:6, we see a reference made to sons of the Most High, and this is a common phrase found in the Ugaritic texts. In the Hebrew, it's B'nai Elyon, but in the Ugaritic text, this phrase, sons of the Most High, would be referencing the children of El. And also with Psalm 82, a lot of scholars believe that it preserves a tradition that casts Yahweh as a son of El, rather than Yahweh being the chief god himself. And then there's Deuteronomy 32:8-9. And it's in this passage that we see God dividing the land and setting up boundaries for the people Israel. And starting with verse 8, it reads, "When the Most High assigned lands to the nations, when he divided up the human race, he established the boundaries of the peoples, according to the number in his heavenly court. For the people of Israel belong to the Lord. Jacob is his special possession." And so these two verses, we have a clear reference to El with Most High. And then in verse 9, though, we have a reference to Yahweh, where we have Lord in all caps. Whenever you see that in the Old Testament, we're talking about Yahweh. We're not talking about El. And so it's saying that Jacob, who later becomes Israel, is allotted to Yahweh. And Yahweh would, in this case, appear to be a lesser god, or even a divine son of El, or El Elyon, and clearly the one in charge. El is the one who is dividing up the lands in the nations, allotting the different lands to the different groups of people. When it comes to Israel, though, in verse 10, it talks about essentially Yahweh kind of rescuing the Israelite people as they were wandering in the desert. And I don't think that the compilers of the text, was trying to say that these are two different gods, but it's evident that these two passages are referring to two different gods. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that might be the case a little bit later. It's also interesting to note that we do see in Canaanite mythology that El's sons were allotted lands or tribes. So it's really not a stretch to say that when Yahweh worship comes onto the scene, that early on, he may have been considered to be a son of God. And then as Judaism really began to take shape, Yahweh really started to take a chief role, and eventually you see Yahweh and El being referred to as the same God. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So all of this talk of Yahweh is a good segue into what scholars believe is the origin of Yahwistic worship. So most scholars believe that Yahweh worship had first emerged somewhere in the southern Levant, partly based on Egyptian texts from the late 2nd millennium BCE, and ruins of the ancient city of Soleb in Nubia were excavated and found reference to a group of people described as Shasu of Yah at the base of one of the columns of the temple. And the temple was built by Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who reigned from 1386 to 1353 BCE, and they're listed as among Pharaoh Ramses II's enemies at the Battle of Kadesh. The Shasu were a Semitic nomadic people, and because of this, attempts have been made to link them with the Hebrews and also with the Habiru, who I talked about in the previous video. The Habiru were not Hebrews. Perhaps some of the Hebrews joined in with these different Habiru groups, but to be in a Habiru group does not mean that you're a Hebrew. And that's because the Habiru were really just a group of renegades and sort of social outcasts, people living on the fringes in the Levant. And yeah, if you want more information, you can look at my previous video, and I talk a lot more in depth about that. And the Shasu were also not Hebrew. They were a Semitic-speaking nomadic group who lived in the southern Levant from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, and they were a clan system. They were thought of as outlaw, renegade sort of people, and they were largely active in the Jezreel Valley to Ashkelon and Sinai. And with that, it is interesting to note that the Bible mentions other nations worshiping Yahweh and how Yahweh arrived from Edom to help the Israelites in warfare. As we see in Deuteronomy 33:2, Judges 5:4-5. But this is not really the central narrative that the Israelites have for Yahweh. In the Bible, Yahweh is depicted as the one true God who creates the heavens and earth, who chooses Israel as his people. But this really didn't develop until later on in Israelite history. So where exactly did Yahweh come from? The Bible seems to contain a memory of him originating in the southern Levant, as it tells us explicitly in Habakkuk 3:3 that God came from Teman, or that he went out of Seir and marched out of Edom in Judges 5:4-5. All of these locations are associated with the area ranging from Sinai to the Negev in northern Arabia. So what might Yahweh have been doing down there in the desert? Reading between the lines, the Bible contains clues pointing to an original identity for Yahweh as a metallurgical god. So in the Bible, Yahweh's appearance is usually accompanied by volcanic or fire-like phenomena. Right? When he descends upon Mount Sinai, the mountains erupt in fire, spewing lava and billowing clouds that are accompanied by earthquakes and thunderstorms. This is a different depiction from what we see with El. Yahweh seems to be a bit more dramatic in his presentation. And though the Bible does go to great lengths to describe Israel's neighbors like the Edomites and Midianites, Moabites as pagans, the text also portrays that Yahweh was worshipped by these nations too, and possibly even before the Israelites worshipped him. And Genesis 36, for example, makes it clear that the Edomites are descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother, and lists Edomite monarchs who ruled, as Genesis 36:31 says, before any Israelite king reigned. So the genealogies of the Bible contain the memory of an ancient confederation of Canaanite peoples who may have considered themselves all descendants of Abraham, and who all worshipped Yahweh alongside other gods. And further evidence of this broad base of Yahweh worshippers can be found in the book of Exodus, where a key role is played by Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who lives near the mountain of God, which is alternatively called Mount Horeb or in Sinai. It is Jethro who indirectly leads Moses to his first meeting with Yahweh at the burning bush, and it is he who inaugurates the tent of meeting with the sacrifice and proclaims that Yahweh is greater than all other gods for having freed the Hebrew slaves from Egypt, Exodus 18:7-12. And here is where we really see those signs of monolatry, right? That Yahweh is greater than all other gods. So there are other gods. It's just that Yahweh is the greatest, the supreme God. But Moses' father-in-law is not an Israelite. He is described alternatively as a Midianite priest, as seen in Exodus 3:1, and a Kenite, as seen in Judges 1:16. And according to the Bible, the Midianites were descendants of Midian, who is another son of Abraham, which again supports the idea of the existence of an extended family of Yahwistic peoples. The Kenites, on the other hand, are a tribe descended from Cain and described as living among all the peoples of the Levant and specializing in crafts and metalworking, which some believe is further evidence that Yahweh's first incarnation was a metallurgical iron smelting god. And so many scholars believe that what we see with Yahweh worship among the early Israelites is a transition from a henotheistic religion to one that is rooted in monolatry. And henotheism is the belief in many gods with a focus on a single god as the supreme deity. And I understand that this sounds a lot like monolatry, and I still don't have a clear understanding of the distinction. But the way I do understand it a little bit is that henotheism is talking about a tribe or a group of people selecting a specific god to worship. So henotheism has to do more with a specific family or tribe, a group of people worshiping one god out of many, right? They worship Zeus, but as for me and my house, we will serve Apollo, right? That kind of thing. So when we see Moses then adopt Yahweh as his God and then Israel as a nation adopt Yahweh worship, now we're seeing a transition to monolatry because Yahweh is being adopted by a larger, more diverse group of people and not just a single family or tribe of people. And then this brings us briefly to the Canaanite god Baal. Baal was another prominent god in the Canaanite pantheon, and Baal is also referenced quite a lot in the Jewish religion. And as with El, Yahweh has a number of traits in common with Baal. So like Baal, Yahweh is depicted as a rider on the clouds, Psalm 68:4, and there are allusions to a battle with a sea or a river in Exodus 15, Psalm 114, and Isaiah 51:9-11. And Baal was a warrior god, and he was described as descending from mountains, riding on a chariot of clouds. He had a voice like thunder. His weapon is lightning. He leads his hosts. He commands the earth to quake and skies to rain, defeats the sea. And so this god sounds a lot like the god in Exodus, right? And the god who is leading Joshua in his conquest in Canaan. Sounds a lot less like the god El of the patriarchs. And so these similarities between El and Baal and then Yahweh has led scholars to believe that Yahweh becomes a sort of composite of these two gods, of El and Baal. But unlike with El, Yahweh adopted the characteristics of Baal but remained separate from him, whereas Yahweh eventually emerges with El altogether, and any reference you have in the Old Testament of either El or Yahweh, you're just assuming that you're talking about the same deity. But then when you reference Baal, it's a completely different deity altogether. And some further examples of Yahweh adopting Baal characteristics. In the poem found in Exodus, the Song of the Sea, we see the adoption of Canaanite myth being attributed to Yahweh, where characteristics that were given to the Canaanite god Baal are also being attributed to Yahweh. And in this poem, Yahweh is being depicted as a storm god. He heaps up the waters with a blast of wind like the storms of the sea at the beginning of the rainy season. And this parallels with Canaanite depictions of Baal, where at the beginning of the rainy season, Baal opens a slit in the clouds and thunders and shakes the earth. Psalm 70 and Judges 5 uses the same kind of storm imagery. Michael Coogan, who is a biblical scholar and expert in the Canaanite texts, has made further connections between the representation of Yahweh and Baal. He notes that Baal was the key figure in a change in the Canaanite religion that happened somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE. And this is the traditional time frame for the Exodus and the introduction of Yahwism. And he believes that there was a transfer of power from the older gods to the younger gods, where El was replaced by Baal after the defeat of a watery enemy, and there seem to be similar changes in the religions of the major cultures in the region. The Enuma Elish depicts the young storm god Murdock defeating Tiamat, the watery god, and defeats her to establish his rule over the older sky god Anu. In India, the storm god Indra defeats Dios, and in Greece, Zeus, who is associated with a thunderstorm, replaces Kronos, who had been head of the pantheon up until that point. So Israel seems to be following suit here. However, they are sort of following their process of setting themselves apart and creating a theocracy by developing a historical account versus a strictly mythological account. So essentially they're saying that Yahweh is actually El and has always been El, and our bloodline has always worshipped Yahweh, and Yahweh is stronger than Baal, and Yahweh is higher than any other god. And that's sort of the narrative, the story that Israel develops and that they adopt and sort of run with as they continue to develop their national identity. So thinking back to the last video near the end, where I'm talking about the different theories of Israelite origins, just that they were probably more or less Canaanite nomads who settled in the central highlands of the land of Canaan and began to intermingle with their neighbors, perhaps fought a few battles, came out on top, as well as just moved into areas that weren't inhabited or maybe were abandoned, and began to develop a centralized group, a centralized kingdom, and then their own unique narrative that would set them apart from their Canaanite neighbors. So looking at the origins of Judaism, it really does fall in line and parallels with polytheistic Semitic religions of its time, and specifically Canaanite religion. And there's also a lot of synchronization with elements of Babylonian religion, and I'll talk more about that in a later video. And then, as we just talked about, you see a lot of adoption of Yahweh worship, and that probably came from people leaving the desert, coming into the Central Highlands, bringing their god Yahweh along with them. And it's probably during the first Iron Age period of 1200 to 1000 BCE where the Israelite religion starts to become really distinct from other Canaanite religions due to this unique monolathrist worldview, where they're worshiping Yahweh above all other gods. And it's pretty evident that early Israelites were monolathrous due to passages where God says that he's a jealous God and there should be no other gods before him. Why would a God need to say this if he knew that he was the only God around? And I understand that you can make the argument that the Israelites were being deceived by Satan, which I'm going to do a video on Satan, or just people who were led astray, thinking that there were other gods that existed but really didn't. But yeah, if that were the case, why would God be nervous about that? So I think that the Israelites clearly believed in other Canaanite gods like Asherah, Baal, Molech, as well as their God Yahweh. And as the Israelites began to coalesce and develop a unique group, a unique identity, they also apparently began to establish themselves as sort of spiritually superior to their neighbors by depicting themselves as God's chosen people. And then so stories were written in a way that would have depicted this, right? Being favored by God, being chosen by God out of all the other nations. And we see Israelite historization of Canaanite practices. So the Israelites are writing a story and associating these Canaanite pagan traditions that were based on cycles of nature and gaining favor with the gods. Pagan festivals are also transformed into celebrations of events that God did for an individual or the nation. Evil is a moral rather than a metaphysical reality. Sin was seen as a choice rather than something that was brought upon you by an evil spirit. And the real clash is between a righteous and holy God and the freedom of humanity to rebel against God's will. And so this really is unlike any concept of God up until that point. God is, in a sense, demythologized and made known by his actions in historical time and in interaction with people. God becomes much more relational and relatable in a sense. And the Mosaic covenant is written as bilateral and conditional. Israel must obey the laws, otherwise God will not fulfill his obligation as their protector. And this was integral to the Hebrew narrative because polytheism would blame famines, natural disasters, defeats by other kingdoms as being caused by the gods. And Israel's newly formed religion had to account for these kinds of things as well. And so we see over and over again in their story arc of famines, wars, exile, are all due to Israel's disobedience to worshiping God properly, the way that he wants them to, and following his laws. So looking at the historical development of the Jewish Bible itself, it's believed by the majority of scholars that the Pentateuch, or the Torah, which comprises of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was composed over many years by many different scribes during the Babylonian exile, which occurred in 597 BCE. And these 5 books include Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Modern scholarly thinking is that the entire Deuteronomistic history was composed in the period of 630 BCE to 540 BCE, and this is the modern idea that the books of Deuteronomy and Judges, Joshua, Samuel, and Kings were compositions of a single text. So looking at our oldest manuscripts that we have for the Old Testament, start with the Silver Scrolls, which date from 650 to 587 BCE. And these are 2 tiny silver scrolls inscribed with portions of the well-known priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers. And the Babylonian exile was from 587 to 539 BCE, so we can safely assume that Numbers was written before the exile, so possibly other books were written before then as well, such as the Book of Jasher and the Book of the Wars of the Lord, which are mentioned in 2 Samuel, Joshua, and Numbers, but unfortunately we have no records of them, no surviving manuscripts. And then there are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are as old as 408 BCE, and so all of them are post-exile. Dead Sea Scrolls consist of ancient Jewish religious, mostly Hebrew as well as Aramaic manuscripts found in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea, and they include many books of the Old Testament, including the Torah, Minor Prophets, Kings, Judges, Isaiah, etc. Then there's the Septuagint, which was written in 3rd century BCE, and this is the earliest existing Greek translation of the Old Testament, translated from the original Hebrew. And then we have the debate of who actually wrote the Pentateuch itself. And really, it comes down to two main camps. Either you believe that Moses wrote down everything, or you believe that scribes wrote various aspects of the Pentateuch, or took things that were already written prior to the exile and composed a working narrative. Now, the last verses of Deuteronomy depict the death of Moses, so of course he couldn't have written the last few verses of Deuteronomy. You could obviously argue that a scribe picked up where he left off to record Moses' death. Consider, though, the entirety of these books are written in third person and not in first person. Exodus, for example, doesn't start with, "And I, Moses, who was born into slavery in Egypt, who revealed the one true God to Pharaoh and led the Lord's people out of Egypt, am compiling the history and accounts of the people Israel," or something like that. This doesn't happen in any of the first 5 books. But proponents for Moses' authorship of the Pentateuch says that we should believe he is the author because the Bible states that Moses wrote these books. However, is that actually what these passages are trying to communicate? Exodus 17:14, for example, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it.'" Numbers 33:2, "Now Moses wrote down the starting points of their journey at the command of the Lord." Joshua 1:7-8, "Do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you." Joshua speaks a lot of the book of the law of Moses, as well as 1st and 2nd Kings, 1 Chronicles, and some of the prophets. And then there are some similar references in New Testament as well. So for your more conservative Christians, this suffices. The Bible says that this is the case, so it has to be the case. But this is classic circular reasoning, using the Bible to prove the Bible. And it's just a little less simplistic than the Bible says so, therefore it must be true. So looking at what these verses are saying, none of these verses really are claiming that Moses wrote the first 5 books, but only that Moses wrote the book of the law and recorded the Exodus, the wandering in the desert, and how Canaan was going to be portioned out. This is not him writing the creation story, the flood story, recording the patriarchs, etc. So, according to the Bible, Moses was a lawgiver and a historian of the Exodus. And there's good scholarship that says Moses is a mythical figure in this case, who is sort of an amalgamation of different figures like Hammurabi and Dionysus. And so this brings us finally to the documentary hypothesis. And the documentary hypothesis is the idea that there are 4 separate sources that are interwoven to form the Pentateuch as we have it today. And these sources are the J, E, P, and D sources. This idea is based on the fact that in the manuscripts that we do have, there are contradictions within the same story. There are doublets, which are repeated stories with slight variations in the details of the story, as well as variations in the name that is used for God. And if the documentary hypothesis is true, and the majority of scholars believe that it is true, it would be a good indicator for the composition of the Pentateuch, as well as Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and Jeremiah having been put together during the exile. And so before I get into the hypothesis itself, one of the arguments against it is that there are no manuscripts for them. So these 4 sources, there are no manuscripts indicating that there are 4 sources. However, the reason for the hypothesis isn't really predicated on whether or not manuscripts exist. Really, it's a hypothesis based on intertextual reading, based on the existing manuscripts themselves. And this intertextual reading hints that there were independent accounts of various stages or ages of Israel's religion, history, and origin that were compiled together at a later date during the exile to create a more cohesive narrative. So starting with the J source, this is called the J source because we have reference to Jehovah or Yahweh. And according to this hypothesis, J source and P source were written during the years of the divided kingdom after 930 BCE. And the J source was written in the southern kingdom, so it's a Judean source. And God is referred to as Yahweh in the J source. Yahweh is presented as the most anthropomorphic form of God. The J source contains a flood story where Noah takes 2 of each impure animal and 7 of each pure animal for sacrificial purposes. And this is because Noah sacrifices animals, and so there had to be more sacrificial animals, otherwise God would have killed them all. Or Noah would have killed them all. And we can see transition from one source to another with the J source because there's a discontinuity and breakdown in the story, and there are a lot of contradictions in the use of the name God within the same story. And then that leads us to the E source, which is Elohim, and the E source favors the Israelite nation or the northern kingdom, and believe its composition was after 930 BCE. And these were texts that referred to God by the name of Elohim and was composed of 2 sources. And it's believed that the E source was composed of 2 sources because there were doublets within this document, as well as just differences in style, language, and interests regarding the priesthood. It contains the 7-day creation poem depicting God as a cosmic creator, and it also contains a flood story. And the P source is the priestly source, which was written during the Babylonian exile between 598 and 538 BCE. And this source focused on the priesthood, i.e., the laws, rituals, sacrificial laws, incense, purity, dates, all the little details like numbers and measurements and record keeping. And it's in this source that we see Israel being touted as a holy nation that's set apart by and for God. And if the documentary hypothesis is true, it would make sense that this source being written during the Babylonian exile, priests or scribes are trying to maintain their cultural identity, their national identity, trying to keep the Israelites from abandoning Yahweh and worshiping Babylonian gods. And it would be in this source that we have a history of the world beginning with the creation account. And the priestly God is less personable. And there's a flood story within the P source where we see God intervening with the flood to sort of fix the world. And there are 2 of each kinds of animal. The priestly source doesn't contain a sacrifice account after the flood because there is not any sacrifice before Mount Sinai, so sacrifices aren't necessary in P until God wants to interact with his creation, specifically with Israel. And in the P source, God moves into the world and selects Abraham and grows a people and gives them instructions and establishes a nation that are supposed to follow him. And then finally, there's the D source, standing for Deuteronomy, or the Deuteronomist source, and believe that this would have been written during the reign of King Josiah between 641 and 609 BCE. So JEP sources are seen in the first 4 books of the Torah, but there are only a few traces of them in Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy was written in an entirely different style than the first 3 books, and there are different recurring expressions and favorite phrases and doublets of entire sections from the first 4 books containing contradictions of detail between it and others. And this led to Deuteronomy being determined as a new source altogether. And it's also believed that this source influenced Joshua, Judges 1 and 2, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And in this source, God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the writers are trying to establish a continuity between Moses and the patriarchs. However, this actually ends up creating a discontinuity. God reveals to Moses that he is going under a new name, Yahweh. However, according to the J source, Genesis 4:26 states that the name of Yahweh has always been known. J wants to assert a direct continuity, but the P and E sources tell it differently. Exodus 6:2-4, God says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. This suggests that P and E reveal a memory of a time when Israel worshipped the Canaanite god El and not Yahweh. So the general consensus among many scholars is that at some point redactors came by and edited, combined J, E, P, and D sources into a relatively cohesive narrative that has a story arc, something that you can build a national identity around. And so after researching all of this, and then this coupled with what I talked about in my previous video with Israelite origins, and even the one before that with biblical inerrancy, all of this definitely shook everything that my faith was standing on. So, it seemed to me then that Christianity was built on the foundations of a religion that really didn't stand up to scrutiny when it was looked at through the lens of archaeology, anthropology, historical extra biblical accounts. And so this naturally called into question Jesus and Paul and the disciples and the resurrection and all of that. And so I knew that I had to continue pulling at that loose thread. So I started thinking more objectively about things like the virgin birth and the resurrection and the rise of Christianity. And the next topic that I really focused on at this point was Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. And I asked a very poignant question, which was, why don't the Jews believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And this was something that I'd never really researched, dove into before. I always kind of took it for granted that Jesus was the Messiah, and that the Jews just didn't understand because they thought that the Messiah was going to usher in an earthly kingdom, and they didn't get that it was a spiritual kingdom. So that's really where my deconstruction process went at this point, and that's what I will cover in my next video. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you then.